She is one of those people that has that wonderful welcoming presence. It doesn't make any difference whether it's in church or in the community or in social events. She gathers people in because she draws them in because she's an inviting person. She does not meet strangers, I don't think, because there are no strangers once Jan has come in contact with them.
In her very low-key way, she has had an enormous impact on serving and being a refuge for women in need and also just for women who want to grow.
Her three things are faith, family, and folks. She loves her, she practices and loves her faith. Her family is the utmost in her mind, and she loves people.
JanusZarro was born in Newark, New Jersey on June 30th, 1947, to Elma and Sam Zarro. She was the youngest of two girls, her sister Judy, 4 years older.
I always think it was terrific to have a sister and not any brothers, because there was really no question that we were just prized in the light of both my father's eye and my mother's eyes, and there was always a message that we were both unconditionally loved.
Her father was a hard-working man who worked in the local power plant. He impressed upon Janus the importance of caring for others.
I received all my soft side from my father. He was kind, he was compassionate, he was non-judgmental, humble, and he lived the values of his faith. He was a volunteer. I always remember him coaching Little League and that sort of thing in the community and through the church.
Her mother was a homemaker who taught Janus tenacity, self-discipline, and how to stand up for herself. She was a loving mother who placed importance on faith and family.
I can remember as a family going to Sunday Mass together, Sunday dinners, which just didn't include the four of us, but included aunts and cousins and friends, and she did that until the day that she died. And lots of wonderful holiday traditions and rituals that I really cherish.
Both of her parents impressed upon Janus and her sister the importance of education.
The message was we could be anything we wanted to be in life, and we had to get a college education before we could consider anything else.
When Janus was about 4 years old, she discovered her strong will and its consequences when attending St. Francis Catholic School Bible Preschool. She had an encounter with the nun who was teaching the class.
This was the old days where the nuns were in that very traditional garb. And it was time for milk, and milk at that time came in a little carton. And I proceeded to spill the milk all over myself. And the nun came over to me and just scolded me and yelled at me, and I proceeded to start crying. At 12 noon, proceeded home and informed my mother that I was never going back to that school.
Her mother informed her that she was, in fact, going back to school. They subsequently had a standoff that would last for 3 days, during which her mother would dress her for school each day and she would have to sit on the stoop until school time would be over.
About the third day, the neighbor downstairs took great compassion and would bring me in the house to wait until I could go back into mine. But I learned a lot from that. I learned it was important to stand up for myself, but I also learned that you pay a price with an authority figure when you do that sort of thing.
Janus was a very good student. She attended Abington Avenue Elementary School and Barringer High School in Newark.
I loved school, both elementary school and high school, and was very involved in all the kinds of activities. I was on the Honor Society, I was the Student Council President.
When she was in high school, the local hospital, Columbus Hospital, had a volunteer program known as the Cherry Aids, or Candy Stripers.
Mother made sure that my sister and I were volunteers as candy stripers. It was my first window into volunteerism, other than observing my father. I have a very positive feeling about hospitals because I was involved in helping people, which is something I think is very important, and I saw the value of volunteering as well.
She graduated from high school in 1965 and entered Rutgers University. It was an era of social change. Like many of her generation, Janus became involved in the politics and activism of the time.
It was the Vietnam War, it was feminism, it was everything that comes to mind. It was the civil rights movement. So my college years were not spent in sorority houses and in the kinds of things that you might think about, but very much being involved in some of the societal issues that were going on. And so it was a great time in college, but it was also a time of activism and turmoil, personally as well as what I was seeing.
She was actively involved in political campaigns of the late 1960s, campaigning for Robert F. Kennedy. On April 5, 1968, like many of her peers, she would see her hopes for the young Kennedy come to a tragic end when he was gunned down in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California. As a major in political science, Janus was enthralled with the concepts of government.
Most of the courses that I just loved in undergraduate were anything to do with state government, municipal government, county government. Loved the course on constitutional law.
Janus graduated from Rutgers in 1969. She set her sights on a law degree and moved to Chicago, where she enrolled in the Chicago-Kent College of Law.
It was actually my first time began living away from home in a bigger city. It was an interesting time for women. There were not many of us at that time in law school.
In law school, she was able to experience several areas of the law firsthand through internship programs.
I can remember having credit hours while I worked in juvenile court in Cook County, Chicago. I did a bit of time doing labor law negotiations with a law firm, so one had a smattering of what were the options and the opportunities available to you with a law school education.
Janus was enticed by the law as a tool to bring about social change.
Part of my reason for going to law school was that was one of the most exciting areas to be in, not because I ever had visions of being Perry Mason and a courtroom for trial purposes, but really to change the society in a very positive, meaningful way.
She graduated from law school in 1973 and began to look for ways she could help change the world. An attorney she respected suggested she begin her career practicing law on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. She decided to make some calls and see if there were any opportunities.
My first call was to the general counsel of the House Judiciary Committee, and he said, "Well, we'd like you to join us." And I was shocked, but of course said yes. And I moved immediately to Washington and began to work on the House Judiciary Committee.
She was one of the first women to serve as counsel to the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives. It was an eye-opening experience.
It was brutal. In fact, I just read a book recently about that wave of women who began at that time, and the analogy was it was sort of like the Marines or that landing on the beach of Normandy without any road map, without any role models, and you just knew you were in for a bit of a rough time. At the same time, it was exciting. It was very male. It was a bit lonely.
She found that once she was able to prove her ability and accept the culture of the time, she was able to accomplish the goals at hand and was accepted by the men as a colleague.
I called it boot camp. Once you survived that initial period, it really, then you were one of them. And so they protected you, promoted you, did all the kinds of things, gave you the assignments that you should have been given, whereas maybe when you started, you didn't get to work on the really good pieces of legislation or issues. You were relegated to some other things.
It was an unusual time for politics. The Watergate scandal had been broken in the Washington Post by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in the summer of 1972, accusing the Nixon campaign of political espionage and dirty tricks. While Nixon was re-elected in November of that year over Democratic candidate George McGovern by a landslide, the duo and the Post continued to pursue the story. In February of 1973, the U.S. Senate established a select committee on presidential campaign activities, chaired by Senator Sam Ervin, to investigate all of the events surrounding Watergate and other allegations of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of Nixon's re-election. By May, when Janus began her position as counsel to the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives, televised hearings had begun.
As a result, though I was assigned to the subcommittee on immigration and had started to do some immigration issues, eventually impeachment became all-consuming. And so many of us who were counsels, our work really stopped in terms of the normal legislation. And I remember the general counsel and the staff director calling me in. And by that time, I had graduated boot camp, as they say. And he said, his were exact words, "Ms. Zarro," we called each other, we're very formal in those days, by our last names. And he said, "Ms. Zarro, you seem to be a lawyer with some personality around here. So we're going to assign you to work with the media while the impeachment proceedings went on."
In her role of media liaison, she was tasked with providing information to the press, damage control, and counseling members of the committee.
The media that was covering impeachment at the time needed stories, and they needed information. And they would do anything that they could to get that story. So very often, if we said, the meeting is over and the members have to leave, they would think nothing of trying to follow to get a member off guard so that he would share something. And so we had to pretty much protect that. What we also would do is if then a member in a unguarded moment, I don't want to say weak, unguarded moment, said something that conveyed in too premature a fashion how the deliberations were going. Yes, they were going to move toward the president in some kind of way. Then we had to do old-fashioned damage control. And so part of my role, we'd sit with quotes, always humor's always great, arm the member. In those days, it was not about getting on camera as a staff person. You were very much behind the scenes, doing everything you could to make that member of Congress look good. And they're the ones that you put out there on the camera. But you were arming them with the quotes and the information and the humor, or telling them, don't get too close to that reporter. She's looking for a story. Or don't go out to dinner with so-and-so. Or don't be alone in the room, have a couple of staff people. So it was that kind of work.
With the resignation of Richard Nixon on Friday, August 9, 1974, and the subsequent pardon by the new president, Gerald Ford, the committee returned to more normal operations, and Janus was able to focus on other issues.
I began to work on immigration issues, and that could be everything from, during that era, it was the fall of the Vietnam War, or the ending of the Vietnam War, and so we worked on refugee legislation, and a number of other issues of that kind.
During the impeachment proceedings, Janus met a young man who was working as a legislative director for a Southern conservative member of the House of Representatives, who was a critical swing vote in the proceedings. Janus would frequently meet with the congressman and his aide, Bobby Wood.
The meetings and whatnot brought us together, though not necessarily in the most congenial of ways. We didn't quite agree on things.
And I thought she was the most obnoxious young person that come work on the Hill. She had an answer for everything. And so she was telling people who had been there a long time, and normally she was always right.
I looked at him as a bit old school and a part of the establishment, so to speak.
Even though I was from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Jan was from Newark, New Jersey, we really had a lot of interest in our love of people, our church activities, our like of politics, and things of that nature that really made us, we soon found out to be very compatible.
They dated for about a year when one night, Bobby decided it was time to move to the next level.
We're coming out of the Capitol, which is always a beautiful setting at night. It can humble anyone.
And I said, got down and said, Jan, would you like to spend the rest of your life with me?
And it sounded pretty good. And I was 30 years old, and it was time to make a decision. And he was a pretty great guy, and I thought, I think I've got a winner here.
And she said yes.
And that's resulted in a 35-year marriage.
It's been a great run.
They were married on November 6, 1977 in Livingston, New Jersey, in Janus's family church.
One of those, big Italian-American weddings that you probably see in movies. And felt a little sorry for Bobby because I don't think he had ever been to one before. So he had the experience of being the groom at one of these extravaganzas that he had never attended. And it was fun.
We had about 75 couples from our friends on Capitol Hill that came to Newark for the wedding. We didn't realize that the festive atmosphere and the great food and the great fellowship it was. Fortunately, all of our friends did not drive back to Washington that night.
Janus served on the Judiciary Committee for 4 years and then took a position as counsel to the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee. It was here she felt she was able to work with members to accomplish impactful legislation.
Really had some of the most progressive legislation that came out, and we really worked in a bipartisan fashion. I remember, Orrin Hatch arriving as a young new senator.
While more women had joined their ranks, it was still a male-dominated environment.
There was a dress code that came out for women, and you couldn't enter the floor of the U.S. Senate unless you had a pantsuit on. And I remember one of my female colleagues being kicked off the floor because the doorkeeper or whoever it was said that her pants didn't match her blazer.
Janus remained in the Senate for the next 3.5 years, at which time she was contacted by a former colleague who suggested she interview with Avon Products. They were searching for a woman to establish and operate a Washington office for government relations. They flew her to New York for an interview.
They made an offer, and I accepted. And that began just an exciting 10 years with a wonderful company.
She was impressed with the company as it was run by women with products for women that were sold by women.
I was able to I worked for the general counsel, but I was also able to do all the liaison work for Avon with a variety of women's groups. And then I was able to get some legislation that was important to the company.
She spent 10 years with Avon as Vice President of Federal and State Affairs, where she developed long-lasting associations. When she was leaving Avon, she was contacted by some former colleagues, now with the law firm of Fox, Bennett, and Turner.
They were interested in establishing a consultant group that would deal primarily with public affairs and public relations, but they were a boutique law firm in that their only clients were healthcare clients.
Her work with the law firm focused on healthcare law and led to her accepting a position with Mallinckrodt Inc., an international company serving specialty healthcare markets in diagnostic imaging and pharmaceutical companies.
That was really my introduction, if you will, from my Senate days back into what was going on in the healthcare industry and with the pharmaceutical companies particularly. And so that was also very interesting, although the corporate world was more my cup of tea.
During her 30 years spent in Washington, D.C., Janus became involved in several volunteer, not-for-profit organizations.
She headed up many organizations in Washington. One of the first women to head the multiple sclerosis, which is one of the largest organizations in Washington, as a layperson, and got to see the good aspects of what that accomplished. We both really like people and like being around people, and Jan has a dedication to doing things for people.
When she was with Mallinckrodt, she became involved with several nonprofit organizations supporting women in third world countries. She was general counsel to the National Italian American Foundation, where she met famous Italian Americans like Sylvester Stallone, Tony Bennett, and was introduced at one dinner to the great Luciano Pavarotti.
He was a very large man, didn't speak English very well. And so I remember going up to him and I looked and I said, "You're so tall and I'm so short." And I didn't know how that was going to be translated, but he understood and he said, "I'll fix that." And so he twirls me around and and I get enveloped in his arms.
She developed a long-lasting friendship with Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro.
She was a great human being, a wonderful congresswoman, cared very much about people, was passionate about the issues that she advocated, very much in the forefront of helping women, not just Italian American women, but all women. It was a privilege to know her, and I will cherish every memory I have.
As a lobbyist, she kept a bipartisan profile and attended functions for both parties. She met presidents including Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton.
He had an enormous ability to make you feel like you were the only person in the room. And the reality is that the dinner at the White House that Bobby and I were invited to had 500 people there. But he made us feel that like we were the only two people in that at that White House, which was special.
At a similar function, she met Hillary Clinton, who was then First Lady. Janus knew she would be meeting the First Lady in a receiving line and was concerned about what she would say to her.
And I read a story in Vogue magazine that she and Chelsea had just come back from Africa and had toured and whatnot. And now I'm there for an art reception, but at the minute I hit the receiving line and extend my hand, what came out of my mouth was that interesting article in Vogue magazine about your trip to Africa with Chelsea. And I could see her eyes just light up, and I figured she didn't want to be there in that receiving line any more than I did. So that's a memory of Mrs. Clinton.
During a congressional trip to Rome with Bobby, the delegation was invited to a private meeting with Pope John Paul. For a faithful young Catholic girl from New Jersey, it was a moment beyond description.
It was almost like you were meeting God. I mean, you had this feeling, and with the Swiss guards around, it was a feeling that one was being enveloped in this somehow superpower.
In 2002, Janus and Bobby decided to leave D.C. and move to Sarasota.
Bobby had finished his career on Capitol Hill. The company that I was working for, I had ended that relationship. They had been taken over by another company. Was doing some consulting, but it was a time in our life when we were just ready for a change.
While she was ready for a change, she was not ready to retire. She was not sure what she would do.
How do you turn a lobbying government relations career and then somehow make that what you do in Sarasota County? I didn't see the connection.
Bobby was reading an article about the Women's Resource Center, looking for a new executive director, and thought this would be a good fit for Janus.
But I didn't listen to him, because I thought, what does he know?
Shortly after, she was attending a luncheon with friends when the topic of the Women's Resource Center came up once more.
At the end of that luncheon, one of the women stood up and said, "Does anybody know anybody really good? Because the Women's Resource Center of Sarasota County is looking for an executive director." And I have this thing, if you hear something twice from different sources, you're getting some message here.
She went to the Resource Center to check it out for herself.
I even went incognito and checked out their resale shop to just see how I would be treated. I walked in and said I was interested in becoming a member to see how they would treat me. And everything was positive, and I decided to submit a resume.
She was hired for the position, and under her guidance, the organization has grown in providing increased services for women throughout Sarasota County.
When Jan came to the Women's Resource Center, I think it was in a state of flux. And she, by directing the activities to really meet the needs of the women in this community, made a huge difference. Whether it was young women who sort of lost their way, whether it was older women who felt abandoned, whether it was women who lost their jobs, and whatever the need, she was able to provide it at the Women's Resource Center. And more than that, she was able to find very accomplished, very, able women to come in and work and teach and serve as mentors to all of the women in this community.
Janus has elevated the profile of the Women's Resource Center to a very high level. She has used her business background to raise the professionalism, the branding of the organization. She has trained the staff and the volunteers alike to really serve the community with passion and dignity.
She kind of engages you, and then she excites you, and then she involves you, and it's all done so seamlessly. I think it's because she believes so herself.
Besides her work with the Women's Resource Center, Janus has served on several boards of local organizations, including Doctors Hospital.
The board is quite diverse, especially a hospital board, because you have a lot of physicians on the board and an equal, if not more, amount of folks that are lay people in the community, leaders, business leaders, if you will. And Janus is not afraid to ask a lot of detailed questions about what some of the board members that are lay people are probably thinking, but maybe afraid to ask as far as a medical perspective. So it makes her a very valuable member of our team. So she's been great from that perspective. She has a diverse background, medical background, for-profit, not-for-profit, governmental background. So she's really a fantastic board member from that perspective. She can really look at all facets of what we're looking at, any particular issue, and give us an objective opinion.
JanusZarro's passions in life are faith, family, and community.
In the Episcopal Church, we have something called a baptismal covenant, and it speaks about respecting the dignity of every human being, and also it speaks of loving your neighbor as yourself. And from a personal standpoint, that's who Jan is to me. She lives her faith because she is a person of extreme care toward human beings. She is a loving individual, very approachable, a welcoming presence, and not one that just smiles and says, "How are you?" She's a welcoming presence because she listens to people, she invites them in. She's very disarming when it comes to someone that comes and talks to her.
We asked JanusZarro her advice for those who follow.
I go back to a statement that I've always felt is so important. This wonderful life that we have is not about us. We're here, we're put on this earth, I feel, to make a difference and to make it better for those who come along, and to really help those who are less fortunate than we are, however we choose to do that. So I think that's what's really important for success and for happiness.